Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Amy plays a Psychic Pickpocket. In response to its enters the battlefield ability, Nick plays a lightning bolt targeting the Psychic Pickpocket. Does Amy get to draw and discard? What about bouncing a permanent? Alright, so unfortunately the first part of this question is a little bit on the bland side. It's not really possible to get a correct answer for this unless you happen to know how connive is worded in the comprehensive rules. I'll go ahead and pull up the appropriate passage here, and using this, it definitely does imply that it is possible for a creature to connive even after it's left the battlefield. I'm not really sure how this would work flavorfully, but maybe it's meant to represent those sorts of cases where someone's dirty dealings only come to light after they've died. Fair enough, I suppose I'll give them a pass on this one. In any case, this rule does mean that it would be possible for Amy to draw and discard with this triggered ability, even if the Psychic Pickpocket has left the battlefield before that ability resolves. And so that's the answer for the first part of our question. The answer to the second part of this question is actually extremely interesting, and in order to help explain why, I've mocked up this dummy version of Psychic Pickpocket with an alternate wording that maybe exists in some sort of alternate universe. As you can see, the two cards are extremely similar. In fact, the only change that I've made is I broke out the When This Connives ability into its own separate line of text. And it turns out that this makes a huge difference. In fact, would you believe me if I told you that this small edit actually changes the answer to this question entirely? And in order to see why, we're going to need this rule here, which indicates that paragraph breaks are in fact what the game uses to indicate that an ability has stopped and a new ability has started. So in this alternate reality version of Psychic Pickpocket that I made up, we actually have two abilities, and they work completely independently of each other. So that would mean that when this card enters the battlefield, then you get to connive. And as long as it's in play to see the conniving happen, then it's going to have its other ability trigger at that point. What I just said there is actually extremely important. With this wording, the Psychic Pickpocket needs to be in play in order to see the conniving happen in order to actually trigger. That's because immediately after anything happens in the game checks to see if there's any relevant triggered abilities that have a trigger condition that's fulfilled by what just happened. Normally, abilities do not work when they're not on the battlefield. And so therefore, if this version of the Psychic Pickpocket was not around to physically see the conniving happen, then it would not have that triggered ability triggering. Now, that is what would happen in the alternate reality with this new wording for Psychic Pickpocket that I just made up. Let's take a look now at the actual wording of Psychic Pickpocket and see if we can explain any differences that might arise. So, as we noticed before, there's only one ability on this card, even though it is split up into two parts. Whenever a triggered ability is resolving, all of its instructions get performed. With this version of the Psychic Pickpocket's triggered ability, there's actually two instructions to perform. One of them is the one where we connive, and the other one is one that sets up another triggered ability in the game land somewhere that is going to look out for when the Psychic Pickpocket connives this way. And so the important interesting thing with this version of the Psychic Pickpocket wording is that all of this is instructions in the same triggered ability, the one that triggers when Psychic Pickpocket enters the battlefield. With this being the case, that's actually enough to change the answer to this question, because now the Psychic Pickpocket does not need to be in play in order to see the conniving actually happen. The reason is because the Psychic Pickpocket has set up the triggered ability that makes you return a permanent as part of the instructions that are performed when the enters the battlefield ability happens. Because it's not an independent triggered ability like it was with the alternate wording that I displayed, that is going to fix it so that even though the Psychic Pickpocket is not in play at the time when the conniving happens, the thing that has a triggered ability that looks for the connive to happen is not on the Psychic Pickpocket itself, but rather it's a triggered ability that exists out in the game somewhere, and it's waiting for that event to happen. Since it's not on the card, it doesn't matter if the Psychic Pickpocket is not in play anymore. And so that's the reason why, counterintuitive as it may seem, you actually do get to return a permanent to your opponent's hand if this situation were to happen in a real game. Really trippy, right? If you found this explanation kind of confusing, that's because, well, it is. Even I had to wrap my head around it quite a few times before I felt confident giving this explanation. The thing that I think really tripped me up is the fact that this sort of triggered ability happening isn't very common in Magic. Usually when you have something like this, you're going to have two different triggered abilities that are independent, like what we saw in the alternate reality version of this card. However, this is the sort of thing that definitely does come up in other cards. For example, earlier this week I made a video about Ligrella, and Ligrella has a very similar type of triggered ability templating, where its Enter the Battlefield ability is going to trigger, and as part of the resolution of that triggered ability, there's an instruction that sets up another triggered ability that happens out in the game somewhere. This one has exactly the same sort of scheme, and so it works pretty much the same way. If you're confused about how this one worked, I would definitely recommend checking out my video that I made about Ligrella and seeing if that explanation from that video helps you understand things a little bit better. But that's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another daily ruling, but until then, I hope you have a great day.